Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube. Just search for my name, Linda Maria Frank. I'm the author of Annie Tillery Mysteries. Click on my picture and my channel will come up. I've interviewed over 150 authors now, and if you're interested in good books and good authors, you can find some very fine books to read and good advice from authors if you're planning on writing a book. We're also on Facebook. The name of the Facebook page is, guess what, The Writer's Dream. And you can find us also here at the studio, ltv-eh.org. Look for video on demand. There's a pull-down menu, The Writer's Dream, and you will see the shows here as well. Today's guest is Helen A. Harrison, and she is the author of An Exquisite Corpse and An Accidental Corpse, and another fine mystery writer, which we are finding that many of us who have a career completely different from mysteries end up writing mysteries. It's an interesting phenomenon. But Helen has a really interesting background. She is an art historian, she is a museum director, she is a journalist. She does a monthly column called Eye on Art in the Sag Harbor Express, and she specializes in modern art. She was, I don't think you're currently the curator of Parish Art Museum?
No, I came to the East End over 40 years ago to be the curator at the Parish.
When it was in the town?
In the village of Southampton, and then also I worked for the Queen's Museum in Flushing and Guildhall Museum in East Hampton.
Right, I have that here. And you're presently the director of the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center, which is a National Historic Landmark.
Indeed, I am.
So you've had a very, very interesting background. So what led you to mystery writing? What about your art career? Anything dramatic that happened that said, I must write a mystery?
I wish I could say that. I wish there were some aha moment that just, oh, this is what I need to do. But I think it really came out of my reading mysteries and often finding that there was just something, you know how sometimes you read something and it doesn't ring true, or there's something that's too coincidental, or that you just say, oh, that's not right. And I thought, somehow maybe I could do that better. I know it's kind of arrogant to say that.
No,
but
I understand what you're saying, because I felt the same way. That was my background. My background is science, and I loved Nancy Drew when I was a kid. But Nancy Drew's approach to mystery solving is like Agatha Christie. It's very surface, and now everything is evidence, the processing of the evidence, protocol. And I thought to myself, I'm going to write a series like Nancy Drew, but I'll make it better because I'll put science in it.
Oh, there you go.
So I think as things evolve, the books do get better. I think mysteries today are better because the writers of mysteries pay more attention to detail.
Well, I just really felt that I could tell a story in a way that whatever twists and turns there were would make sense, and that when it was finished, you would feel like, you know, you really had understood what it was that the story was about and how it was resolved in a believable way. And I, for some reason, got it into my head, it comes out of my art history background, that the Surrealists would be a good setting. The Surrealist community in New York City in the 1940s during World War II, when many of them were here in exile and were basically sitting out the war in New York, I thought that there were a lot of interesting characters there that I could spin in interesting ways. But of course, it was not going to be a factual book. It's fiction, and it's a combination of real people doing fictional things and fictional characters interacting with them.
Well, it's almost as if your setting is a historical setting, and so you really have like a historical mystery.
Well, that's the idea, is to put it into a real context so that people would recognize it if they were familiar with the area, if they were familiar with the period. But also, the conceit is that these real people who were actually there at the time did not do the things that I am having them do, although sometimes they are. So
yes, I understand what you're saying.
It's a combination of fact and fiction, and the idea was that these people, you would recognize them, but then you wouldn't necessarily know whether or not what I'm telling you is the truth.
Yes, yeah, but I think that's what people who write historical fiction do all the time.
Well, I guess the classic of that genre is E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, where Coalhouse Walker is a fictional character, but then he interacts with real people, like Stanford White and others of that era. And he goes to the Morgan Library, it goes to a real place. So these people were in New York City in 1943 and were doing other things, and some of them were doing what they really were doing, and some of them were not.
Doing other things.
Like the guy I kill off on page 1.
Oh. So An Exquisite Corpse takes place in Greenwich Village?
Yes.
Okay, so what was it like to research what Greenwich Village was in 1943?
1943,
What is it
yes.
about 1943? My fourth novel takes place in the present and 1943.
Well, it was during World War II, and so the artists were present. I grew up in New York City, so I'm pretty familiar with the neighborhood. I hung out there a lot when I was a kid, and it's just got so much character. And this is where these people actually did live. One of the artists lives in Patchen Place, at number 5 Patchen Place, which is, if you've ever been to Patchen Place, it's this little one-block alley.
Tiny little street.
Totally charming, and he really did live there. And his upstairs neighbor was the poet I mentioned. So they were tailor-made. And the problem I had with the book was, never having written fiction before, I really wasn't sure how to make the plot drive. It was something that was unfamiliar to me, because all my other books are nonfiction.
Yes, I was going to ask you that question. How did you make the transition from writing something that is fact-driven? I mean, people who are reading your nonfiction books are reading them to find out the truth, find out facts. Whereas when you write fiction, you are inviting them into a world that is really not real.
Right.
And you have to capture them in a different way.
Right.
So
I guess because of my art historical background and training and doing research, that's, of course, you don't necessarily know all the facts, but some of it is conjecture and some of it is opinion and supposition. But you try to put that in the context of what really happened. And the idea of having a fictional plot occur in a real place, that was the challenge, I guess. But I wrote it over a very long period of time. I literally, it's a book about surrealism, so some of it did come to me in my dreams, and just the process of using these kind of random thoughts and pulling them together, that was hard because I had not ever worked that way before. But in the end, I feel it was well resolved and it all worked out. And that was my first book. And then the second one came much more easily, because that's based on an actual incident in 1956, the death of Jackson Pollock in an automobile accident.
now, when you submitted An Exquisite Corpse to, you have a traditional publisher?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously you worked with an editor.
Well, actually, when it first came out, I did self-publish it, but I did hire an editor.
That's
And
what I
she
did.
was excellent. She was very good. When I called her about something, and I said, I think I better go back and walk those streets again, because I want to be sure that it takes 15 or 20 minutes to get from A to B. And she said, oh, I did that.
Wow, she was good.
So I thought, that's a good editor. But the second one, it's actually an interesting story. I would not have had a publisher at all if it hadn't been for the East Hampton Star. They wrote an article about the Doyle sisters and Elizabeth and Caroline, who had started a publishing company called Dunmere Books. This was the summer before last. And one of them writes young adult, that's Liz, she writes young adult fiction. It's a series called the Junior Lifeguards. And Carrie, the other one, writes murder mysteries set in the Hamptons. And the second book is a murder mystery set in the Hamptons. So I sent the manuscript to them, and they liked it. And they said, we want to publish it, and we also want to bring out the first one as a prequel, because some of the characters carry over from the first book to the second. And then they said, please write a third one so we can have a trilogy. So
Yes.
I've done that as well, and that will come out in 2020.
When you have an editor and the editor is very good and you're not a fiction writer, what I found was when I started to write my books, I didn't know anything about writing a book. I mean, I've read a book, I know what it looks like, and you know, the table of contents and whatnot. But so I decided to take a course, and it was one of those things where you had to do so many chapters. You know, you had a textbook that told you about, you know, plot, character, and setting and whatnot, and then a mentor would read it over and give you tips. And I found that there were 3 or 4 things that they told me that really changed my writing for the better. Did you have that same experience? One, they'll say, well, you shouldn't really do it this way, you should try that.
Well, I worked for the New York Times for 28 years.
There you go.
I was the art critic for Long Island, so I covered Nassau and Suffolk County for the Long Island section. And I had several editors, each one of which had a very distinctive tone and style. But of course, newspaper editing, journalistic editing is very different from editing a novel. But in the books that I've worked on over the years, I wrote one for Harper and Row, a monograph on Larry Rivers, had an excellent editor for that. I did one with Connie Denny on Hampton's Bohemia, the artists and writers of the Hamptons, and we also had a very, very good editor. Mostly it had to do with style.
Yeah.
Rather than content. I've never really had much interference in terms of content.
But that's what I mean.
Yeah, it's really about passive voice and things like though and although. You know, I mean, these are little nitpicky things that just make the book flow better, and also have a kind of, you want your own personal voice to come through, so you don't want it to be too heavily edited, otherwise it's not your work.
Well, of course.
But there's nothing that's ever been written, including the 10 Commandments, that couldn't be edited. I mean, you need those other eyes on it.
People today are trying to edit the 10 Commandments. Have you noticed that?
I think that's been done several times, actually. But I really feel strongly that no matter how experienced you are, you do need that other set of eyes on it just to give you the feedback, because you can make some stupid mistakes.
Yes, and everyone in the field of writing will tell you need a good editor. They'll tell you first, if you want to traditionally publish, you have to have an agent, which doesn't always work, but the editing is very important.
I did look around for agents, and I wasn't able to find one. Well, I have no track record in fiction. As I said, all my other books are nonfiction, so there wasn't anyone I could go to. And you know, you can look online, but
I think just reading books. One of the things that, of course, I come from the field of education, so all of my friends are teachers, most of them English teachers. So when I decided to write a book, I expected to get a lot of, you know, a lot of interesting comments. But what they said to me, which I thought was interesting, was I said, "How do you write dialogue?" And I said, "How do you not write dialogue in a book?"
You hear people speaking.
Yeah,
I
said, and they said, "How did you do that?" I said, "It's just people talking."
Right.
Because I see the book as a movie in my head, and it's just them talking.
Yeah, it's action. You want to propel the action, and nothing propels the action like a conversation.
Also, if you take the dialogue out, you can turn a 250-page book into a 25-page book.
Well, of course, you know, don't tell that to Marcel Proust, but what I found was that the dialogue almost writes itself. It's the characters and the plot that you really need to focus on.
Oh, yeah.
Because once you've got that set up, then you can hear them speaking and it just comes out. But in the second book, well, actually in both of them, there are specific types of characters who speak in a certain way. And I wanted to get that right. Now, for the first one, they're all these
tell me
European
about your
emigres.
characters.
Well, they're the surrealists. We have a Chilean, we have a French, we have several French people, we have Americans who are associated with that group, and certain, like the art critic Harold Rosenberg, he had a certain voice, and I wanted to get that right. And I was very pleased when someone who actually knew these people told me she had read the book and she felt that she could hear them speaking.
Well, that's...
That really made me feel like I'd succeeded.
That is where
in
your
that.
art background really
Yeah.
helped you out.
Well, it's still, you could get the character wrong. But in the second book, I have a number of characters who are local people, Bonnickers, as the East Hampton people from Springs are called. And I wanted to be sure that I got them right because they have a specific way of talking or not talking. They're very kind of closed-mouthed bunch. But anyway, I asked Prudence Carabine, who is a 12th generation Bonnicker and an English teacher, if she would read it for me and tell me if I had the voice. And she did, and she was very complimentary. I was very, very pleased that I had, because I've worked up there for 30 years now, but I'm not a native, and I don't live in the area, so I wanted to not misrepresent them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that air of, that's something that makes me love a book, is that air of authenticity, where you're taken out of your ordinary place and taken to another place. It's like visiting. It's like going on vacation and visiting an interesting place.
Well, that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I have a friend, a fellow author, who quotes a man, I can't remember the name, but the question is, where do you get your inspiration from? And the answer from this author was, if I knew where that was, I'd visit it more often.
That's very good.
So, and kids, that's what kids ask me all the time. Where do you get your ideas from? And basically I say, you're a sponge from the time you're born.
Well, of course, I absorbed all of this as part of my job. And the Pollock Krasner House, where I've now worked for almost 30 years, is full of research material. We have a whole study center devoted to researching not only Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, but their whole art community and the surroundings in Long Island. But it doesn't have everything. However, the East Hampton Library, the Long Island collection, has marvelous archives, and they have, I needed to research, Pollock was killed in this automobile accident, and his body was taken to the Yardley and Williams funeral home, which at that time was on Newtown Lane, and they have the funeral book records of all the different funerals and all the different, because it also doubled as the local morgue, and it's all there in this ledger. So I know how much his wife paid for his coffin, for example, because it's written down. How much it cost to take out a death notice in the Herald Tribune. And, you know, this is priceless stuff because it gives you the color. And I didn't have to make that up. Now, of course, the beauty with fiction is that if I couldn't find that information, I could make it up.
Yes.
But I thought it was more interesting to use the real information.
Yes. Research, I think, is the most important tool when you write a book, because it can lend color, it can lend authenticity, and when I read a book, I love when I can learn something from the book. So if I learn something about the setting, and I think setting can be a character.
Oh, definitely.
And I was going to ask you that question, and I know that you wrote the Hampton's Bohemians, and so that must have given you really a lot of material for your setting and your characters.
Well, one of the things that we do is, as part of our research, we answer questions for other researchers. So when people call us up or come to the house to do research, we have all that material and we provide it for them. So it was right there at my fingertips. And that's what made the second one go so much more easily, because this is a story that I know well. And actually, when I suggested it to my husband, he said, well, doesn't everybody know that story?
No, no.
And I said, no, I'm going to twist it. I'm going to change it so that it's not going to be what really happened. So everyone knows what really happened, but this is going to be a twist.
Sure, sure. So why Pollock?
Well, why not? Of course, he lived a very colorful, interesting life, and a life that's been the subject of 3 biographies and numerous monographs and scholarly articles and conceptual articles and you name it. He's almost a mythic figure. But his tragic end, which was really so sad, was kind of the stuff of legend. And I just thought it was such a perfect vehicle for a mystery, because he wasn't the only one killed in the car. There were 2 passengers with him. One was his lover and her friend, Edith Metzger, who had come out for the weekend, and she was also killed.
But his lover survived?
His lover survived to write a memoir about it, and she only died at the age of 80 a few years ago. But this was, I thought, a good twist. Supposing Edith didn't die in the car crash. Supposing she was already dead. So that's the twist. And then we have to find out who killed her. Why was she dead before she died? So that's the mystery.
It's a little touch of Teddy Kennedy and Chappaquiddick.
Yeah.
There was always the question of, was Mary Jo Kopechne dead when she went into the water?
Right.
I actually visited that bridge. Actually,
really?
there is no bridge left because souvenir takers had taken splinters, so many of them, that they had to rebuild another bridge to take its
Make it out of
place.
concrete this time.
Yeah, they did.
How funny. Oh.
Only chip away at it, whatever. Now, I have to ask you about, you have recurring characters.
Right.
And my theory is that you have to make your characters lovable, or interesting, or very bad, for people to go, to keep following these guys, Hannibal Lecter, those people like that. So, which are your characters? Lovable?
They're lovable, yes.
Okay, good.
And they're also very, very engaging, I think. I invented them for the first book. I needed a couple of police officers to investigate the crime, which is the murder of an artist in Greenwich Village in his studio. And one of them, see, the reason I picked this particular artist, even though he did not die at the time, he actually lived until 1982, but I kill him off in 43. But he's Cuban.
Such power.
And his father was Chinese, and his mother was Cuban. The father went to Cuba to work on a sugar plantation, married a local girl, and Wilfredo Lam was born. So this led me into Cuban territory and Chinese territory. So we have Chinatown on one side and Spanish Harlem on the other. So we have a cop from Greenwich Village who's investigating, and we have a cop from Spanish Harlem who's helping with the investigation. The Greenwich Village cop is a typical Irish policeman named Brian Francis Xavier Fitzgerald.
Brian Francis. That's got to be a
nice
Xavier
Jewish
in there.
boy. And then we have Virginia Diaz, Juanita Diaz, who is the one in Spanish Harlem. So, of course, they meet on the job and sparks fly and they fall in love. And at the very end of the first book, they are planning to get married. And then in the second book, they are married and they have an 8-year-old son. So I liked them. These are people I invented, so I kind of fell for them.
But you fall in love with the characters.
And
you
I
invent.
thought I can give them more to do.
Are you in any of the characters?
No, not in this book. Because I was indeed alive in 1956. I was not quite born in October 1943 when the first one was set. I was 12 years old in 1956, and in the third book, I was very much alive. And so there is a character in there that resembles me.
Yeah, because people ask me all the time if Annie Tillery is me, and I always tell them Annie Tillery is the teenager I would have loved to have been.
But there are 3 living characters in the second book. The first book, they're all dead. In the second book, the little Bonneker boy who teaches their son how to fish, he is still very much alive, Mike Collins. And I asked him if it was okay to use him, and he said yes.
Good.
And Seal Downs is an artist who was a friend of Jackson and Lee. She's still alive. She's very elderly, but I also got her permission. And then a third person who features very peripherally. I wasn't able to contact her, but later on she said it was okay. But all the other characters are either fictional or no longer living.
So in summary, I would say your books have intriguing characters, a great setting, and the plots are to be discovered. And we have a little bit over a minute left, so what I would like you to tell me, what was the most interesting part of your author's journey?
I think inventing the characters, because the characters who existed, the ones whom I know about or knew personally, and some of them I did know personally, I didn't have to make them up. I could just use what I knew. But the invention part was both challenging and very rewarding. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I did too. I would find that I'm writing something that's completely different from my series. Well, it's not completely different. It's another mystery, but it's younger kids. And I find that I go to that zone, and it's so nice to be there. It's so nice to leave the bills and the cats and everything behind and go to this little zone where I can be these funny little kids. And
well, and then of course you want your readers to relate to them, and that's the important part. You're not just writing for yourself, you really are writing for your audience. And if people enjoy it and feel that these characters have come to life, then I feel like I've done my job.
And so we're looking forward to the third book, and the name of the third book is?
That is An Artful Corpse, and that is set in the Art Students League in 1967.
Okay. That's it. I look forward to that.
Well, thank you.
I'm
I
going
hope
to
you'll
read
enjoy
these
it.
books. So, any advice for a new writer?
Right.
Just keep writing, right?
If you doubt that you can do it, try it. Just do it. See how it works out. I mean, if you don't try it, you'll never know. And maybe it'll be a mess, but at least you gave it a shot.
Thank you so much, Helen.
Oh,
This
it
was
was a
really
pleasure.
a pleasure.